Mark DeYmaz is creating the future of the local church. His books on multi-ethnic leadership, social justice, and church economics are sure to be manuals for church leaders for decades to come. But he's not merely an academic, he's also a practitioner. We are here today at Mosaic Church of Central Arkansas, a church Mark helped found. This church is multi-ethnic, it's socially responsible, and you guessed it, it's financially sustainable. I'm going to give you a warning, your mind is going to be blown in this episode. So let's find somewhere to do this podcast. How about that? This looks kind of like a dungeon. Let's check it out. Let's see what's in here. Ooh, I think this will do just fine. What's up, everybody? I'm here today with Mark DeYmaz in Central Arkansas, Little Rock. Good to see you.
Yeah, great to be with you, Robbie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is a lot of fun. We are on the campus of Mosaic Church. They're very creatively using the space to meet the needs of their local community. So Mark, I would love to, before we talk about what you're doing right now, tell us a little about yourself. How did you become the person that you are today, and what drives you?
Yeah, well, again, it's great to be with you, Robbie, and everyone watching today. I actually grew up in a single-parent home, born out of wedlock, 1961, at a time when only 6% of kids were without dads, born out of wedlock in the United States, latchkey kid before the term was coined. I grew up Jesuit Catholic. The motto of the Catholic Jesuit faith then, it's become more gender inclusive now, but it was men for others. So ingrained in me is this idea that we're to live our life for others, and that came from my Jesuit upbringing. But really, I played college baseball, became a Christian at the age of 19. By the end of that 4-year career, I was too slow to get drafted. I had nothing better to do. I was a psych major. And the church that I'd become a Christian at, which was a conservative Baptist church in Scottsdale, my hometown, they offered me the position of being a high school pastor. I didn't even know what that was, but it turned out I had some natural gifting at that. A couple of years into it, went to seminary, led to a 10-year or 18-year career in student ministries. The last 8 of those I ended up here in Little Rock, working for a large suburban white mega Republican church. Phenomenal church, great years, 1993 to 2001. My youth group went from 150 to 600, the church 2,000 to 5,000. Just an incredible experience, and I wouldn't be the leader that I am today without those 8 years at that church. But in the late 90s, I took a look around that church one day, and I realized that the only people of color were janitors. And that began to bother my spirit. I didn't know what bothered me about that. And again, this is 1997. But something bothered me about that. And it took about 3 or 4 years, continued to do my work with student ministries. But by 2001, I basically did my own homework in the New Testament and came to realize that every church in the New Testament outside of Jerusalem was what we would call today a healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse church. Men and women, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, walking, working, worshiping God together as one. And it was that demonstration of the gospel, not merely the proclamation of the gospel, where these diverse men and women were being brought together, the Prince of Peace lifted up, drawing all people into himself. This is what advanced a credible witness of God's love for all people. More than the words of the gospel, it was the work of the gospel. And so ultimately, we left in 2001, came to the inner city here in Little Rock, and with what Christianity today would call 3 years later a big dream in Little Rock, and that is that diverse people ought to be able to walk, work, and worship God together as one in a local church in Little Rock, Arkansas. I had no idea that we were part of a forefront of a movement that continues to grow and is about to enter the early adopter stage today. So it's been quite a ride from those streets selling Avon with my mom at 7 in Alameda, California, to where we are to here. But the understanding that I've gained through the years in terms of working with diverse people, walking with diverse people, worshiping, is something I wouldn't trade for anything.
Yeah, that's so good. So let's key in on, you've got a church model that has 3 legs. It's got the spiritual leg, it's got the social leg, and it's got the financial leg. Let's key in on the spiritual leg, on the multi-ethnic church movement. You've got, coming up this semester, we've got the Mosaic 2019 Mosaix, is that how you say it?
Mosaix,
2019 conference down in Dallas. I'm looking forward to going to that. Tell us about this movement and maybe a little bit about its progression and about where you see it is and going.
Yeah, so real quick, in terms of the model, I wrote a book in 2017 for Thomas Nelson called Disruption. repurposing the church to redeem the community. And this is what you're referring to. It's a three-legged stool model. It's modeled in a sense after an American football team, which is actually a team of teams. We often don't think about it like that, but an American football team has 3 teams on one team, right? Offense, defense, special teams. Those teams are so different that they don't even play the same game.
Right.
Offense is a very different game than defense, and defense is a very different game than special teams. And it's so different, they're never on the field at the same time. And they all have their own head coach.
Yeah.
Now, we don't typically break it down that way, but that's true. What I've realized over the 19 years of doing this work is that the vast majority of churches play a one-dimensional game. And I call that the spiritual game, right? Everything is pitched to the spiritual, evangelism, discipleship, small groups, worship. All that's well and good, but that's the first leg of the stool. But in the 21st century, as we were talking about, it's just like the first. In the 20th century, it was words. Billy Graham, share the gospel, right? 4 spiritual laws, evidence that demands a verdict. Josh McDowell. It was words that won the heart in the 20th century. Today, it's works. It's works of justice and economics. And being aggregated and advanced by the local church. So we need to get beyond having just a spiritual game to also our social justice game and our economic game, our sustainability, put it all together, because that's what's going to advance the gospel, create community flourishing down the road. Now, having said all that, talking about this first leg, the macro move for the American church is through planting, growth, through transition, to get away from homogeneous churches, which unintentionally inhibit our ability to declare a credible gospel in an increasingly diverse society.
And statistically, a homogeneous church would be what percentage?
Yeah, so a homogeneous church, we say monoethnic, basically say it like this. Over 80% of the attending members are of one particular ethnic background or cultural background, all Black, all white, all Asian, all Hispanic. And by the way, there's so much more to being a healthy multi-ethnic church than just counting diversity in the pews, right? But sociologicals gave this number back in 2000, which is a segue to say, transitioning to, on the spiritual leg, we've got to develop churches that reflect the kingdom of God on earth that is in heaven, more specifically reflect their diversity of their communities in order to cast a credible witness of God's love for all people in our diverse society. Now, in terms of progression on this movement, there was a 40-year forerunner stage from 1960 to 2000. The first book ever written was The Circle Church in 1960 by DeYmaz. But it was a good attempt, lasted 7 years, failed in the civil rights movement. Bits and pieces, in other words, a person here, a person there for 40 years, but certainly no movement, very flatline. There was a book published in 2000, Divided by Faith, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. That really marks the beginning of the movement. And many people read that book like I did, good numbers, and championed it. Michael's a good friend of mine now. They followed up later with a book, United by Faith, but it was a bleak ending. He's like, so the way we can deal with racism as society and dismantle it is we would have to first dismantle it in the church, but don't look for that to happen anytime soon. Well, people like me read that and go, wait, that's a God-sized challenge. So from 20 years, from 2000 until this moment, literally, at the end of 2019, we've been in a 20-year pioneer stage. It's half the length of the other, 40 years in the forerunner, now 20 years. But when Michael published that book, it was the first time that statistics were given to the old adage that 11 o'clock on Sunday is the most segregated hour of the week. Everybody said that literally since 1880, but nobody knew the percentage. So they gave it a percentage, and they said, we'll call your church multiracial, multi-ethnic if you have at least 20% diversity.
That's sociologically different.
Right. So that's where we got that number. Now, in 2000, that number was 92.5% of churches in the United States failed to have at least 20% diversity in their attending membership. 12 years later, in 2012, 2013, that number had gone to 86.3, and more than 20% of churches will, in fact, have 20% diversity by the year 2020, which is something our network has championed since 2006. And that's going to usher in a 10-year early adopter stage, which takes us to 2030, and a 5-year mainstream stage, so that by 2035 or so, the healthy multi-ethnic churches will be normative. They will be the credible and relevant ones, and right ahead of the time that the entire country in 2042 becomes a majority minority, where 1 in 2 people will no longer be white in this country. So you really see this is something God is doing. This, and by the way, the multi-ethnic church and the movement, that is nothing new. In fact, it's a reformative movement. This is what was going on in the first century. And my good friend Alan Hirsch, he wrote a book called Forgotten Ways. I mean, it's like we forgot, and we got away into our natural man and our segregation, what's easier, what we like, and our preferences. But it's really a reformative movement, and that's all about that first leg.
So a couple questions on that. When it comes to, you mentioned we kind of got off track. Do you think there are specific ideologies or reasons why we got off track that need to be addressed at a ideological level as opposed to just at a practical level?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first, can I say sin? I mean, like,
Sure.
the human heart, and it's just sin, right? I mean,
Yeah.
in the sense of not understanding fully the gospel, etc. But racism is a spiritual problem, so it's rooted out in the spiritual man at the heart. Now, so that's basically a first understanding. When I say that, well, it's sin, I mean, that's kind of flippant.
Sure.
The fact is, it's easier to be with people who are like you. It's naturally what we gravitate to. It's what we prefer or what we like. And that's just, so maybe it's not so much sin, it's just human, right? It's human to be these things. But for instance, yes, it's harder to walk, work, worship God together as one with others who are different than you, but there's no pass for degree of difficulty in pursuing the will of God in the New Testament or in the Bible, right? So yes, it's harder, but no pass for degree of difficulty. Yes, it's not what I like so much, if you will, from the human man standpoint, humanity standpoint, but it's not about building churches the way what I like. I thought it was about doing what Christ wanted and what the Holy Spirit and what the Apostle Paul. So aligning my preferences with his preference and his expectations, the Word of God. But then also, it's not natural. Sure, birds of a feather flock together, but when we signed up for this Christian thing, it was about living in the supernatural, right? Getting beyond what is otherwise natural. So those ideas are all in this idea of our humanity that keeps us apart. But the other reason is that we basically, it's not that we've been taught incorrectly in the New Testament concerning the gospel, it's we haven't been taught fully.
Sure.
And that takes us into theology, and the theology, and this is really where it starts. You cannot build healthy multi-ethnic churches on political correctness, the changing demographic landscape. All that is like shifting sand. It's got to be built on strong theology, and the theology is there in the New Testament. It's just been, it has not been fully brought out until these times. Now, Paul brought it out, Ephesians chapter 2 or 3, and he says, people long to understand this in the past. It's been revealed to us. Gentile inclusion in the gospel, the church, the kingdom of God. But again, over 20 centuries, in the natural man, and the reason we said. So it's a restorative movement, reformative movement, but it's rooted in theology. And so our movement, my own life, my own writing, our church, really mines the theology of it, that Christ envisioned it on the night before he died, John 17. Luke described it at the place called Antioch, Acts 11. Paul, the Apostle Paul, prescribes it for the church. In other words, it's not just nice, it's necessary, not optional, it's biblical. And this is throughout the life and writings of Paul. And once you see it, it's like, sometimes, anytime somebody's bought a new car, whether it's brand new or it's new to you, you think, hey, I'm the only guy with this car. And then all of a sudden you see it everywhere. That's exactly what happens when we unlock some of these keys and codes, if you will, in the New Testament. All of a sudden, and then what people have said to me over 20 plus years now, why weren't we taught this? Why, how did I miss this? But that's the fact. So it's not that we were taught erroneously or wrongly about the gospel. It was just incomplete.
Right.
And that's what God, in the last 20 years particularly, has been bringing to the surface in terms of theology.
Yeah. So zooming in on this principle, I think since the 1955 HUP, I think is what Donald McGavran, homogeneous unit principle.
Yeah.
And it was originally intended to be a missionary principle.
That's right.
To be able to translate the gospel into a local culture. And I think that probably stemmed from an attempt to get away from more colonial mindsets of, you have to do it this Western way. I think it was maybe a reversal of that, saying let's make it easier for people to be able to embrace the gospel.
Yeah.
You've noted that is supposed to be used as a missions and evangelistic technique, but not as a church growth technique. And I want to key in for people that are interested in particularly the multi-ethnic church model, and then I want to get onto the social and financial aspects. In the ebook that you wrote, I bought it, it was really good. You talked about kind of two failed attempts that you guys had in trying to embrace a healthy multi-ethnic church. One was, I think you said intentional exclusion, where it's basically, all right, this church meets at this time and this church meets at this time, and the Hispanic church meets over here, the Black church meets over here. And then there was unintentional exclusion, which is where, all right, you're in our environment, but it's still kind of like you're other people swimming in a white sea sort of thing. And then the third model is what I'd love for you to unpack for us, and because it's worked for you guys, so I'd rather focus on that than the ones that didn't work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, well, you're talking about what's called the homogeneous unit principle.
Okay.
Some people say homogeneous, but it's known as the homogeneous unit principle, and most people don't realize this, but that is the root of why their churches are the way they are. And this principle, as you mentioned, it was actually mined in the 1930s or so in India by Donald McGavran. He came to Fuller in 1966, School of World Religions, and began teaching this principle. Now, if Donald McGavran was alive today in this room, he would say what I'm about to say, and we get this from direct quotes from him. But this principle was an evangelistic discipleship principle. In other words, his key concern was seeing the nations saved, seeing people converted to Christ. And he recognized the fastest way from a human perspective to do that is to, let's just say you're in China with first generation Chinese people. Yeah. The fastest way to see a first generation Chinese person come to Christ is to connect them with a first generation Chinese believer. They speak the same language. They don't have to go through cultural. Exactly. Now, can God use me? Sure. I've led people from different cultures, but from a human standpoint, that would be the fastest way to accelerate the gospel in terms of evangelism and discipleship. And that's true. And it's very biblical. This is what Christ did. He came to the Jews, he became a Jew, he discipled, he evangelized, and then he sent them to the nations. But by the time you get to Acts 2 and the formation of the church, and more particularly Paul, there's not a single church in the New Testament that's where there's any validation or expectation you're going to plant, grow, or develop a church focused on a single people group. Right. Now, sure, people can bring up exceptions. Hey, what about the island of, somewhere out in the Pacific and it's one church? Yeah, but there's always class. There's always distinction. It's about eliminating erroneous distinctions at the end of the day. But certainly in a country like America and the diversity of the Western world, there's no excuse to be segregated anymore. And so this principle, though, in 1972 is actually when it was started being taught in 1966 in that way, but by 1972 it began to morph, and the principle, which was people come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic and cultural barriers, it became the church grows fastest. Right. And essentially that gave every white pastor in this country a seemingly biblical excuse that went, for the most part, unchallenged to plant, grow, and develop churches in their white suburbs and neighborhoods. And so this proliferated the megachurch. This proliferated because it works. It's a pragmatic principle.
And if that's how we're measuring success,
if that's what you're measuring success, exactly. And if you want to get a lot of whoever, black, white, you give them the color of carpet they want, the preaching style, the time of the service, the music, you put it in their neighborhood, and yes, your church will grow fast with one demographic group of people. And this really gets to this idea of metrics, because we measure success by size. But in the 21st century, it's not by size, it's influence. And the greater your diversity, assuming structural health, the greater your influence will be in a community. You could have 5,000 white Republican suburbanites in one church. When they get on Sunday, yeah, it's a lot of people, but they largely go into the same, they return to the same neighborhoods and the same jobs and the same social circles and the same vacation spots and the kids in the same schools. But I could have 200 people from 25 nations and diversity, and when they get on a Sunday morning, they go into like 8, 9, 10 slices of the demographic pie, and so that means our message is going forward and our influence. So it's not about chasing size. If you're a church planter, pastoring a church, we tell you, don't chase size, chase influence. And the greater your diversity, the greater your influence, again, assuming structural health.
All right, guys, quick commercial break. Today's episode is brought to you by thechurchahead.com, resources and advice for forward-thinking Christian leaders. If you're wondering about the concepts on this episode and how they might apply to your church or organization, we would love to schedule a free 30-minute video call with you to answer any of your questions. You can learn more by visiting thechurchahead.com. Now, back to our show.
All that is this homogeneous unit principle that crept its way into church planting, growth, and development erroneously, where it should have remained as it is. So even today, in our church, this goes to modeling, we have a Spanish venue, we call it, first generation Spanish venue. We have Hispanics, I mean, our elder chairman is Puerto Rican. I mean, our staff, our next senior pastor is Colombian. We've got well integration with even some first generation folks, but certainly second and third, total integrated. But obviously there's still a lot of people, first generation language, etc. So if you came to church at Mosaic on a Sunday morning at 10:45, let's say, you would see a 10:45 service in English and a 10:45 service in Spanish in two different places in the building. Now, the casual observer might go, well, you're segregating and you're separating and all that. And like, no, you don't understand. So basically, the reason we have that service is to evangelize and disciple first generation Hispanics, right? Practicing the homogeneous unit principle. But we do it in the same place and time, in the same space, because all the kids go to the same children's ministry. All the kids go to the same youth group. So you're looking ahead to the second and third generation while still evangelizing, discipling the first generation with music and language and all that works. Now, the leadership, they're on staff. They are Hispanic, first generation. Now they English, if you will, they can speak as well. But having said that, the leadership understands what that venue is and what it's not, and that's super important in practice. You can't just get somebody. Let's say we're talking Hispanics, and say, oh yeah, Hispanic pastor, Mexican, Colombian, whatever, pastor these people, because if their vision, and this is what you're referring to, we ran into this because we had a really thriving Hispanic ministry of 150 people after 4 years, and really led by, he's still a good friend of ours, but he just wasn't able to make the leap to multi-ethnic. He was still focused on a homogeneous Hispanic church, and it was very painful, but we got to the point where we had to agree, not really agree to disagree. We said, look, that's not who Mosaic is. So we created unintentionally a church within a church, and I'd rather have 5 people that get it than 150 that don't. And so basically we had to pray for them. We called it a splant. It was a split, but it was a plant, right? So we blessed them. It wasn't anything ugly. But it's like, hey, you guys want to go with Pastor Osmani? Yeah. You go up the street, he's got a building. It's going to be a Spanish church focused on Hispanic people today. Yeah. But if you want to stay with us, we're going to focus on Hispanic people today and in the future. And literally, because the family ties, all that, man, I'm telling you, out of 150 people, we ended up with like 8. Yeah. And they all left, and we started over. Now we're back to 100, but all those people get it. Complete integration in the church. But again, practicing the HUP in the way it was meant to be practiced, but then there's pathways all the way to the elder board. So you're not stuck here, and you're not isolated here, not marginalized here. Right. It's part of the total package of Mosaic. Yeah, that's really good. So I'll ask one more question, and this is tapping in because I know you like technology as well, and you geek out on Singularity and all those things. So in your writing, you've taken some of the scriptures that originally were written towards Jew and Greek, and that can be kind of another way of looking at that is dominant and subdominant, depending on your lens. And you said, what if we applied that to white and black, for example? Given that Ray Kurzweil says that in 10 years the human brain is going to be mapped and basically algorithmically re-engineerable. So given that humanity it seems like we're going to a place where we're going to be upgraded and better integrated, or more so integrated with machines and cyborgs and all that sort of stuff. If a concern was ethnocentrism in the early first century, are we going to have to worry about anthropocentrism, basically humans versus machines in the future? And what does the gospel say to that? Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly don't want to pretend to be an expert on it, but I have read, I do have conversations, I'm involved with folks. In fact, my next book, Coming Revolution in Church Economics, the afterwards written by the world's foremost clergy expert on AI in the world, my good friend Christopher Bennick. So I've had these discussions, not an expert at all, but yes, I think down the road, it's not far-fetched, or it's easy to see, if you will. The battle won't necessarily be so much race, class, cultural divisions, as much as man against machine. Now, mankind, right? Men and women, but humans versus machines, that will be, increasing tension. And then that also takes us into this idea of what does it mean to be human? Right. And what defines our humanity, because like you said, we're moving towards a point of singularity. Now, whether that actually happens, whether Christ comes back, who knows? I'm not going to live that long, unless maybe if I was your age, hey, I might be able to live for 150 or 500 years, right? But which, by the way, think about that. I got my great-great-great-grandfather still the #1 giver in the church. Okay, so I don't know how that works. But all that's to say is that there's so much coming that the American church and pastors are completely unprepared for. And it's important that we start thinking about this. For instance, that we engage technology, that we don't fight, flee, run away, fears, because that's basically 2 responses of Christians right now. It's either to fear it and to demonize it. Technology. Technology in general, AI, artificial intelligence, whatever. I like to call it alternative intelligence. Okay. For instance, a plant is intelligent. A dolphin is intelligent. You see, and everything's alternative to God. Now, I didn't make that up. That's my friend Christopher Bennick. He uses that language. But if God is like the baseline intelligence, anything that is not God but has life in some form or fashion is an alternative intelligence to the ultimate intelligence. And so there is intelligence baked into plant life. There is intelligence baked into the animal kingdom, if you will. And there's intelligence baked into humans, right? As we evolve and merge in some ways with machines, whether we reach a point of singularity or not, these will open up the question of what does it mean to be human, and we're already there. Blade Runner, for instance, and heart. This is all the rudimentary beginnings of it. But it's really going to be a very metaphysical, whatever conversation about. And I think we need to be thinking about. So the point is, don't fear that conversation. We want to run to it, not away from it. And the other thing is, we either run from it in fear, or we go, well, hey, it's not going to affect me. That's going to happen in 30 years. I'll be dead by then. But this is the moment, because Christians need to engage at an ethic level. We need to be coming alongside the scientists, and they are open to it. They just can't find any Christians willing to speak into it. And they make these dogmatic statements in terms of the gospel. But all that's to say is that technology has always helped to advance the gospel. And I think we should lean into that because of the opportunity that we're going to have to advance the gospel technologically, just like the Gutenberg press. I mean, people are afraid, it's a demon thing. Okay, look what it's done, right? It gave the entire world the Bible, many that can read it in their own language. So you just have to get over the fear factor or the flee factor, like I'm out of here, and actually lean into it by faith and engage. And so what would you do as a pastor? I encourage you to read. Go to online, ChristopherBennick.com. Great place to start. He's a great thinker, gospel-centered guy out of the PCUSA. Tremendous thought on that. But he'll
be at the conference as well.
Yeah, he's speaking at the conference. And there's other places you can go, but very few at the moment. But I think we should engage, lean into it for all kinds of reasons. The last thing I'll say about that, because it's a very fascinating subject, but if you're a pastor of a church, this isn't just like a future conversation. Automation is going to displace 12 to 22% of jobs by the year 2030. Imagine, already we know in terms of church economics, tithes and offerings are stagnant or in decline. The average budget fell from $150,000 to $125,000 in 2009 to 2014. You're going to be looking out on a congregation of 200 people, let's say, or 2,000, whatever, and 15% have lost their jobs in the last 6 months. What's that going to do, not only to your budget and to your job and to the well-being and sustainability of your church, but how do you pastor them? I mean, you're talking about numbers and displacement of job that is like, if I remember right, don't quote me, but I think I heard it's like 3 times the depression. And it's not that people can't be retrained for jobs, it's the time it will take. And so that's going to affect the church as a business, like salaries, property, and the emotional toll that it's going to take on your congregants. How do you lead them through that? So for all these reasons, I appreciate the question. Most people aren't smart enough to ask it or think about it. But boy, we got to lean into this, and this is how the human race also can be increasingly united, even by sociological issues. But the gospel is there to say, no, we're not just uniting because we're afraid of machines or what have you. No, we are called to be one in Christ, the kingdom of God, the gospel, advance it, and then use and leverage technology to advance the coming kingdom of God.
Yeah, that's so good. So you mentioned some of the themes from your upcoming book. Let's talk about that a little bit. Can you unpack? I know you already did, but what are like some key takeaways from the book that you think people are not thinking about right now that they need to be thinking about?
Yeah, great question. Well, again, we just mentioned a few of them: sociological changes, demographic shifts, generational differences in terms of giving. These are things that pastors, 35, 40 and up, are not thinking about right now. But all this is going to affect giving, and that means that tithes and offerings will not in and of themselves be enough to sustain the work in the future. So there's a sociological issues that we have to think about. The middle class, the situation with the middle class, for instance. I mean, virtually no home today that's middle class has less than 2 income streams. Ozzie and Harriet days, 1 paycheck, everybody lived the middle class life. Those days are gone. So just like that, the single paycheck is a tithe and offering for a church. It's not enough. You need multiple streams of income. So there's sociological factors that are there. There's also theology, because for instance, and we deal with this in a book in a chapter called Free Your Mind, where take like a passage like somebody say, well, the church should live by faith. What do you mean you're starting businesses and you're generating income? And the church is called to live by faith, George Mueller and all that stuff, right? Well, then you just ask him, say, hey, let me ask you a question, Robbie. You ever signed a lease to buy a car? Like, you ever signed and took out a debt on a car? Where's your faith, man? You ever go to a doctor and they prescribe and they give you pills and
Yeah.
you're sick and you take the pills? Where's your faith, man? Like if individuals, that's not what faith,
Right.
exercising faith means in individual life.
Yeah.
Why would it be this? Why would we
Yeah.
expect the church not to have risk and exercise faith by being intentional? What is good stewardship in the Bible? It's not taking care of the church grounds or accounting for money. Sure, that's a part of it. But very specifically, biblical good stewardship is, here, you gave me 5, here's your 5 and I made you 5. Here, you gave me 2, here's your 2, I made you 2. One guy sat on his asset. Think about that.
Yeah.
One guy sat on his asset, in the story it says, wicked servant, take that asset from him and give it to the guy who knows what to do with it.
Yeah.
So we've got to disrupt, if you will, our notions of theology concerning church economics.
Yeah.
And then just a couple others. We go in the book then to 7 directives to how to do that, which include things like, what does it mean to become a benevolent owner of your facility, which is a fancy way, if you will, of saying rent your space, but you don't rent it for top dollar. You do it in a way that's benevolent to the community, but you still make some money, right?
Yeah.
So benevolent ownership or monetizing existing services is, we use an example in the book, like, virtually every church in America serves free coffee on a Sunday morning. Well, how much does that cost?
Right.
Has anybody ever thought about that, right? So if let's just say you go, hey, it costs us $300 a month to give free coffee. Well, think about it. Tithes and offerings as unto the Lord, go into a plate, come back here.
Yeah.
Some board decides we're going to spend $3,000 a year on free coffee. And with the hope that people will find us hospitable, they'll join the church, maybe they'll give. No business does that. If they give you a free cup of coffee, they know how they're going to sell something to you on the back end to replace that. So there are things the church is already doing: janitor service, coffee service, print shops. These things can be monetized in a way where you could recoup. So let's say it costs me $3,000 a year in free coffee. I could sell Jimmy Dean sausage biscuits for $2. I can buy them for $1. I can sell $3,000. I can recoup the cost of the free coffee, put $3,000 back into the budget, and use that for youth scholarships in the summer to camp.
Yeah.
So again, this is under the heading
and
of
then
monetizing
employ those people
existing.
with your business.
Exactly. So monetizing it, but we give directives of how to do this, creating multiple streams of income, starting new businesses, monetizing existing services. But it's rooted in an understanding of theology and sociology that I think is heretofore is missing in the conversation. So at the end of the day, church economics will stand alongside, in my opinion. You have Dave Ramsey, FPU, hey, which is a great thing. We're going to help you understand finance, get you out of debt. Pastors deliver it not only in discipleship to be benevolent, but they're thinking, hey, you got more money, you'll give us
give more to the church,
right? And any pastor that doesn't say that is not telling you the full story, right? But just because you have discretionary income doesn't mean you're going to give it to the church, which gave rise to the industry of generosity.
Right.
So now we got to teach you to be generous, right? But even FPU and generosity, yes, keep teaching it. Yes, keep doing it. And tithes out, of course, it's not going to be enough. The government's going to tax your property someday, very likely.
Already
the
happening in Pennsylvania.
That's right, in Pennsylvania. The government can take away tax-exempt status for the local church. There is coming economic change. We're at $22 trillion in a debt in America. Everybody's looking, where can I get money? And the church is a big target. So for all these reasons, we've got to practice smart economics. So church economics is going to be this next category of say, Dave Ramsey on the individual level, generosity. Church economics is when you think about the local church itself as an entrepreneurial engine that is helping to repurpose abandoned property, create jobs, lower crime in a community, transformation, but at the same time leveraging our assets to bless the community, but doing it in a wise way. We're generating some measure of ROI and return to supplement stagnant or declining tithes and offerings.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. And the book's called The Coming Revolution in Church Economics.
Why tithes and offerings are no longer enough and what you can do about it.
Yeah, that's huge. Yeah. On a social impact plane of things, there's a writer named Chris Valentin, and he has a book. It's called Poverty, Riches, and Wealth. And one of the interesting things, I'd never heard this before, he contrasts the parable of the talents with the parable of the minas. And he says one of the main differences between that, in the parable of the talents, it said basically you've made more money. The parable of the minas says your money has made you more money. And he says, therefore I will give you cities. And he says the key there is that compound interest is actually the key to taking cities. And
that's really good. I'll have to check that out. That's really interesting.
And so as you're not only just sustaining, but really growing and developing streams of income, that gives you influence in the city to be able to bless the city, which goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, to be a blessing to all nations.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about that, and I'd read that book or research that passage. to your point, I think that also happens, like you said, not just on the economic side, but on our second leg, social justice and compassion.
Right.
Because we have seen that happen here in the inner city. Because as we've done good work, Matthew 5:16, let them see your good work, largest food distribution in Little Rock, immigration counseling, 7,000 to 8,000 people, working with kids who age out of foster care, the chess club, all these things, as they came online in really small ways, all of a sudden there was synergy.
Yeah.
And I think I was mentioning to you earlier, yesterday Starbucks is here doing a community project, and Baptist Health, and so all these people, because there's a phrase called, and I really do believe this, that in the 21st century we need to embed the church in the community. Right. But I've also seen we're actually embedding the community in the church here at Mosaic, because that synergy of social services, when you gather 500-600 people every week and you're feeding and clothing and all that, well then, health initiatives go, wow, where can we go to the community? Well, oh my gosh, we got to go to Mosaic, and all of a sudden you've got a health clinic, or it's just
you're leading culture instead of leading culture. Trailing.
That's right, and it goes to that point of, so that could probably happen, like he's saying, like you're saying, on the economic side, but we haven't had tons of economic power here because we're still But what we have had is a lot of social justice and compassionate work that's accomplished the same thing.
Yeah.
And so I totally agree, and you can see that principle.
Yeah. Hey, when I told you your mind was going to be blown, I wasn't kidding around. So much new information, I'm going to still be processing it all. Hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. A few things for you guys. If you're on the Praise Hands monthly support team, you're going to be able to enjoy a walking tour. Mark and I walked around the whole building, inside it, looking at new businesses that they're starting, how they're using the space to love their community. Visit praisehands.com/donate to learn more about the monthly support team. If you want to volunteer with Praise Hands, visit praisehands.com/volunteer. Our teams are growing and we'd love to have you. And lastly, if you enjoy this podcast, we would so appreciate a 5-star rating and review on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might be listening. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys. We'll see you next week.